we'll go ahead and start. Ian.
Okay.
Okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, everyone can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the public engagement team of Belfast South Methodist Church, the Agape Centre, we'd like to welcome you to the second of our 2 evenings on the theme of Towards the Elimination of Poverty. My name is Helen McHugh and I'm a member of the congregation in Belfast South. Thanks to modern technology, we've many of you joining us from the length and breadth of Ireland, as well as from across the sea, as we say. And wherever you are, you're very welcome. We're very glad to have with us this evening the Reverend Dr. Martin Fair, the moderator of the Church of Scotland, and the Reverend Dr. Tom McKnight, the moderator of the president of the Methodist Church in Ireland. Thank you to the representatives of community organisations who are here and who I'm sure will be wanting to join in the discussion. During our first meeting, we learned a lot from the presentation by Paul Morrison, who is policy advisor with the Joint Public Issues team based in London, and which is made up of the Baptist Union, the Church of Scotland, the Methodist Church, and the United Reformed Church in Britain. And we're delighted that Paul is here again this evening. I would also like to welcome the representatives of the political parties. In alphabetical order, they are Paula Bradley from the Democratic Unionist Party. And we understand Paula may be a bit late in coming, but we have Eva here at the moment who's holding the fort, and hopefully Paula will arrive later. Robbie Butler from the Ulster Unionist Party, Claire Hanna from the Social Democratic and Labour Party, Ronan Mclaughlin from Sinn Féin, and Kate Nicholl from the Alliance Party. Thank you all. Our facilitator this evening is again the Reverend Dr. Johnson McMaster, who in his own inimitable way will be responsible for keeping us all in line and on track. Thank you, Johnson, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
Helen, thank you very much. That makes me sound like the Chief Whip. Great to be here. I'm glad that so many have joined. Let me begin by running through the running order that we will try to follow this evening. Between now and 20 to 8 or thereabouts, this little introduction. And then I think we're meant to move to the politicians, and the politicians, when they speak, will have 5 minutes each. They already know this, and because we want to give everyone a fair chance, you will have an indication when your 5 minutes is almost up, so that we stay with that kind of time frame. From about 8:15 until about 8:50, I suppose, there will be an open plenary discussion when everyone will have an opportunity who wishes to speak, and perhaps ask questions or look for some clarification of anything that has been said, or to make observations or make comments. So that is plenary discussion from about 8:15 to about 10 to 9, 8:50. Then we will finally go back to our political representatives, and each will have the opportunity to make a final comment, no longer than perhaps 1 minute each. And from about 5 to 9, we begin to conclude and wind up the evening. I suppose a framing question might be for the evening, what are the problems we're trying to solve, or what is the problem we're trying to solve in relation to poverty and the elimination of poverty? Given that Paula is going to be somewhat late, we will probably take Paula at the end of the group of 5 representatives. So let's move first to Robbie Butler from the Ulster Unionist Party, MLA for the Lagon Valley. Robbie.
Hello, Johnson. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for the invitation tonight. Thanks to South Belfast Methodist Church and all of those guests and friends that have joined us tonight. So yes, my name is Robbie Butler. I'm the MLA for Lagon Valley, the Ulster Unionist Party, and I actually am the Chief Whip for the party, Johnson. So you carried out your Chief Whip duties magnificently. And I will say fair play to Paula Bradley for being a bit late. If I could have done that tonight, I would have been in it, listened in to see what everybody else said. And because I think if anybody comes on here tonight and says as a politician that they have the answer and they have the single direction, they'll be telling fibs. I think what would be really useful tonight is if we can certainly lay out where we see the pressure points and share ideas that maybe the commonality of what we can garner tonight might give us the direction which will inform strategy and policy going forward. So as a member of a party which is in the executive, it's really important that especially people from Northern Ireland hear what we have to say tonight. So I sit on the Education Committee. I'm the education spokesperson, but I'm also the spokesperson for mental health. So in some ways, the right person to talk to tonight might have been Andy Allen, but I have spoken on this subject a number of times, and probably because of the correlation between poverty and other issues that we could term as dual diagnosis. So we do know that in many of the reports, not just towards the population of Northern Ireland, but around the world, that those who live in poverty or in areas of social deprivation and those things also suffer from a multitude of other issues, such as drug and alcohol addiction, suicides, isolation, housing stress, and health inequalities. So when we think of poverty, it's not just the fiscal poverty that we need to be addressing. It is those other insidious assets and facets that actually people have to live with. And it's really quite sad when we think about it, that someone who is suffering poverty, and if you take housing stress for an example, where perhaps there's damp or mold or windows that need fixed, that the very person who needs the help the most is the person least able to actually affect that change. And that's where we need to make sure that we've got all of our strategies pointing in the right direction. So as a legislator, if you like, what do I see as a responsibility of the Ulster Unionist Party and other legislators? Well, I think we have to start at the very beginning, which is that the financial aspect of this is critical. And political instability is probably our most difficult opponent to grapple with here in Northern Ireland. If we look at the things that the institutes like the CBI report on, if you ask them what is the #1 threat to creating wealth, creating jobs, financial gain for Northern Ireland, they will say political instability. And anybody that has lived here for any length of time will know that, and know that, we wrestle with it, and we're continuing to wrestle with it, and we really need to put that to the top of our agenda. And every political party will say that poverty is one of their priorities, and I'm sure it is. But if we're serious about it, if we are serious about tackling that in the lives of the people that live in Northern Ireland, then political stability is the first thing that we need to sort out. And obviously, with the rhetoric of a number of political parties here, it's hard to see that is a priority of theirs. But it's something that we need to encourage each other to find that common ground where we can develop the strategies and policies that will bring that. I think the other thing that maybe doesn't get talked about, Johnson, is data. And about how we uncover those people who are in poverty. And one of the things that I would be particularly worried about is there's some of it is visible poverty, and we use that by the metrics that, you know, fiscal income, whether that's low paid families, whether that's you live in a certain area and stuff. But what COVID has shown us is the disconnects in community. In 2021, we're not connected in the same manner that we used to be. We don't enjoy the same relationships as we used to do. Businesses are constituted and employment contracts are different than they ever were, 0-hour contracts and all of those things, which actually don't add into driving and tackling poverty. The other thing that was a benefit, perhaps, if you look at COVID in terms of how we're going to fix this, was the interoperability of the community and voluntary sector. But I think that needs to go onto another level. I think government will bring probably 70% of the fix here, but when government sometimes, and probably more so in Northern Ireland, is disconnected from the communities. But we do have community groups. We do have community and voluntary charity sectors. And I'm really, really pleased to see the churches have really stepped up over this last couple of years and taken issues like poverty and mental health really seriously. And that's somewhere where I think they should be. But I was thinking of a little thing that I heard in an education debate with regard to young people and the development of policy and strategy. And I'm going to say this, and if it's something that I think it's just something that I'm pondering on. So when we develop strategies and policy to eradicate poverty, right, it's important that the public, and especially that those that are affected, need to be participants of that change and that design, and not merely recipients. I think we do those people a disservice who are trapped in poverty by talking about them, by designing fixes that we think will meet their need, and we haven't included them in the conversation. So those people need to be participants in the design of what we need to do, and not just recipients. And I learned that over this past while dealing with young people in the education sector, when we're talking about exams and how they would like to navigate this next few years, Johnson. And I think that's something that might be a valuable tool as we develop strategies and policy. How long have I got left? Have I any time left, Johnson?
You've just over the 5, Paul.
It's Robbie.
Robbie, sorry.
If you're thinking of Paul Butler, he was a Sinn Féin councillor in Lisburn Council a number of years ago. We're not even related. We're not even related.
I've already had one bit of mistaken identity this evening.
That's not a problem. Listen, I'll stop. Johnson, I've lots to say, but I'll stop there for the sake of time.
There'll be opportunity, Robbie, in the open discussion, but thank you very much for that. A number of important points I think you raised there. Can I apologise to Paul Morrison, because I have mistaken something I saw go through in a chat line, and this is a serious error on my part, because what I realise now I saw going through in the chat line was a message from Paula. I actually thought that was Paul, but my apologies, Paul. But you were supposed to give a summary of 5 minutes of what you'd said to us a couple of weeks ago, and maybe we could take that summary now, and then we'll move on to our next political representative. Thanks again, Robbie, for that. Paul.
Thank you. And I was feeling bereft and slightly shunned, but I'll get over it. I'll get over it. And actually, it's grand that I'm following on from what Robbie has just said quite well, because I think one of the things that's really important is that when we discuss poverty and when we design solutions, it needs to be grounded in the reality of the lives of those who experience poverty. And I mentioned a bit last time about a group called Glasgow Poverty Truth Commission that I visited, and it was a transformative experience for me, because there are many reasons, but one of them was I discovered that the Department of Work and Pensions Advice to Decision Makers Guide, a very big and boring book, can be a comedy. Because I sat there and I told them the rule and the reason for the rule, and the people who experience poverty explained to me why the rule affected their lives, and started laughing that the policymakers and what the policymakers' intent was. I had an afternoon of just laughter as they realized that these policies were meant to shape my behavior in a certain way, and they're never going to do that. And that dissonance sort of continues. There's a wonderful group called UCUS, and a number of their members are actually in Belfast, which are people who receive universal credit, and they're talking about their experiences on receiving universal credit. And you may have heard the phrase, it's to make work pay. But what that means in reality is that there's a really complicated calculation made every month, and then you find out how much you're going to get. And while it's meant to make work pay and incentivize people to go out to work, the reality is what it means to families is they don't know how much they're getting at the end of the month, and they can't budget. And the people who go through the calculation, which is hard to do, and there's lots of mistakes go missed because it is so hard to do, but the people who do the calculation, they see that one of the main parts of it is to take 65 pence of benefit away for every pound you earn. So rather than it being this great incentive to say, isn't it great that I'm working, what you actually see is, Why am I getting taxed at 65% when other people aren't? So if it had been designed alongside people who experience poverty, you wouldn't have come up with that solution. But if you go to think tanks and you go to economists, there's this beautiful graph and it looks lovely. It's called consistent work incentives, and they love it. One of the other things is that it needs to be grounded in the data. And again, I'm following on from Robbie. It's almost like it is planned, Johnson. Because one of the things that happens is lots of what's being talked about in poverty is about a poverty that existed a long time ago. Today's poverty tends to be young and not old. Today's poverty tends to be about disabled people who can't work and those with caring responsibilities who aren't in work, who hopefully will be able to get to work later on. And the huge story of the last 25 years has been in-work poverty, has been that people who are unemployed tend to get jobs quite quickly, but those jobs don't last long, they're not paid well, and going through this cycle and cycle and cycle of in work and out of work. And over 2 million people are living in families in the UK where they have 2 adults working full time, and yet they are still in poverty. And that suggests something has gone quite radically wrong. And so the last thing I'm saying, one of the other things I do is I'm a trustee at Trussell Trust. And we came up with a 5-year strategy for how it is we wanted to intervene in poverty. And I'll sort of offer it, intervene in changing poverty in the UK. And I'll sort of offer it and see whether it's something that people think is worthwhile. And it's 3 prongs. The first is about changing communities. It's about understanding why poverty is happening, having relationships on the ground to build in support that can move with people's needs and understand people's needs. It's to change policy, which are things like making universal credit work, getting rid of the 5-week week, all of those things that we know in policy make the lives of those who experience poverty more difficult. And the last one, which is about changing minds, because often there are negative stereotypes, there is stigma. Today's paper included the story that about 1.5 million people didn't claim universal credit because there was stigma attached to being a benefit claimant. So they'd rather go without money than have that stigma. How can we change minds that says that benefits are for all of us, that poverty is something that exists in our community and is not to be ashamed of, it's something that we can work together to solve. So I'll leave that there, and I think I'm under 5 minutes because Johnson's looking happy.
Yeah, you're under 5 minutes. That was an economy of time. Well done. We'll move. Thanks, Paul. We'll move now to Claire Hannah, who is the MP for South Belfast and from the SDLP. Claire.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Apologies, I was supposed to be Paul Mclaughlin, who I know had been keen to take part, who's our North Belfast councillor and who is driven and whose work generally is around poverty alleviation. Folk might be aware of him from he runs the People's Kitchen and outreach and homeless and addiction services across the city of Belfast, and for example had coordinated a lot of the COVID community support, and somehow manages to be a mental health nurse and a city councillor at the same time. But his magnificent time management skills unfortunately fell apart this evening, so I'm replacing him. I hadn't actually looked at the plan for the evening, so I was trying to think of arguments for why I wasn't next alphabetically. I was thinking we should go by party, should be alliance, but I've just scribbled a few things down. I mean, to concur, I must say I did have an opportunity just before we met to read your document, and I was genuinely delighted to see it, and what a comprehensive approach that you're taking that is about social justice rather than just charity. And I suppose that basic principle of not just pulling people up whenever you find them fallen, but understanding why the system is leading so many people into poverty. And as Social Democrats, the SDLP's approach is the same. It is looking at the systems that are and aren't delivering for people and rewarding enterprise and work, but making sure that the vulnerable are protected. So as Robbie and Paul have outlined, there isn't a silver bullet and there isn't a single reason that people are in poverty, but I'll just touch on a few of them. One, it's an economy here in particular that isn't thriving, and it isn't thriving because we don't focus on it, because as we know, we scratch the wounds of all the other things that divide us here, and we don't take the time to go through and do the policy things that will have a meaningful effect on people's lives. And that's clear, for example, in the fact that the Assembly doesn't have a live anti-poverty strategy. Its child poverty strategy is kind of getting rolled over from a few years ago, rather than bringing in fresh ideas. And as Robbie outlined, it's things like having instability, which deters investors and prevents us getting decent work and kind of what we would have traditionally called breadwinner jobs for people and people at different stages or different outcomes in terms of their education. As Paul very adequately touched on there are real flaws in the welfare system, and the so-called reforms of the last 10 or 15 years have left us in a lot worse a place, and they started from really outdated prejudices, really, and misconceptions of who is using or who's needing welfare and why, that just don't match with just the reality. I think anybody who's an elected representative and sees the cases that they deal with, and when people have got stuck in fairly Kafka-esque systems, and Paul outlined the fact that universal credit just doesn't allow people to plan their finances, and it actively disincentivizes work when people got it. So that's not to say there weren't flaws in the benefit system, but the reforms have not achieved anything. They've not set out what they should have achieved, and they didn't happen alongside reforms to work as well. And looking at things like low pay and things like inadequate childcare that are kind of trapping people even who want to work. So we might pick up on that later, but that system quite simply isn't working, and we need to be honest about that. Housing is an issue as well. I mean, we have a lower than required public housing output, and we should see that as an investment, and it is very common across Europe to have a decent housing stock. It is also worth saying, and I've just completed a piece of research that says for key workers, if you're a key worker here but low pay in retail or at some of the lower grades in the health service, a key worker who isn't with a partner trying to purchase on their own is unable to buy 98% of houses privately available in Northern Ireland in terms of the housing costs. And that person, because they're in work, will struggle to reach the top of the housing waiting list. So there's real feelings there, and in our private rental stock as well. So housing costs are overwhelming for people. Education, there are, I mean, there's some great things, and as we know, there's some real winners from our education system, and we should be glad about that. But there are real feelings as well, right from early years, and the fact that you can kind of track a child's progress really from they arrive in school, from the first day at P1. A lot of these things are mapped out. The fact that the transfer test still makes kind of sheep and goat out of young children, and has really poor outcomes for a lot of children who don't, win a place at some of the schools. Some of the schools we're very lucky to have here in South Belfast. And then, people go two separate ways when they leave school. About a quarter of people leave without really being able to read and write to an adequate standard. And then another quarter of young people here find that they have to leave for further education. And really exporting young people after you've invested in their education for 12 or 14 years is one of the most wasteful things that a region can do in terms of building them. So I had some other things scribbled on my bits of paper, but I suspect I'm running out of time. But look, all these things are solvable. People have done them. We can start to focus on them. We can have strategy. We can decide that actually, instead of identity politics, we're going to address these things. We can make improvements. And as Paul and others have said, the data is there. In many cases, we know what is wrong. But a big is about hope. It's about people feeling that they have opportunities and a place, and that links into societal cohesion and all sorts of other things. But looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Claire, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And we move on to Ronan Mclaughlin, Sinn Féin councillor for the Black Mountain area. Ronan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Johnson. It's great to be here. I suppose I'm sort of a blow-in from West Belfast, but I just want to thank the South Belfast Methodist Church for the invite. I know Charlie McAteer couldn't make it, so I'm happy to step in, similar to Claire, and try to address some of the issues. I suppose poverty and the root causes of poverty are very complex, they're multifaceted, but they can be solved. And I'm actually going to probably be a bit more controversial than Claire and Robbie before me, because I actually think that poverty is a political choice. And that term, that poverty is a political choice, was actually termed by a Professor Philip Allison, who was a UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, when he said that the UK's decision basically from 2010, from the austerity agenda started, that it was a political choice by the British government at that time to follow that austerity agenda. And if you actually look at the COVID crisis and you look at the immense amount of support in terms of the likes of job retention schemes, in terms of business support grants, all of which is needed to keep the economy going, why couldn't that have been reciprocated in 2010? But it was a political choice at the time not to do that. British government's borrowing is at one of its highest at the moment, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. They're borrowing from the Bank of England at this point, and they're simply printing more money. So it was a political choice in 2010, just like it's a political choice now to go down another route. And in around that time, you had the likes of the public sector pay freeze, and we may come back on that in our general discussion, because we're now talking again about a public sector pay freeze, which inevitably inflation is far in excess of a pay freeze. So in effect, every single public sector worker is now getting a pay cut. We have the welfare reform agenda, as people have talked about, and I've done my wee inverted commas because it wasn't about welfare reform, it was about cutting the welfare budget. And I think Paul made an interesting point, and the government talked about making work pay, and generally that actually is a good thing. Making work pay is a good thing, but it's been phrased the wrong way, because how they've made work pay is to lower benefits and to make people to go on unscrupulous contracts, low wage economy, because the benefit system has been cut. It's been cut by billions of pounds, over £12 billion of cuts. So that low pay is forcing, that cuts to the welfare agenda is forcing people into the low pay economy. And then topped on that, you've had since 2010 significant cuts to the Storm and Black grant. And as I said, all of them were political choices. There could have been different, there could have been investment done, there could have been economic stimulus. And the problem about poverty is that it doesn't matter where you live, because we live in a postcode lottery. So I live in Andersonstown in West Belfast. Someone who lives maybe in BT12, which is the neighbouring postcode, has completely different life expectancies, educational attainment opportunities, and we need to look at that. And I'm actually just going to read you just a few stats that came from a Department of Health report. And this looks at the NISRA statistics in terms of the wards which are so-called the most deprived. So generally, if you lived in some of the most deprived wards and you are male, you will live to the age of 74. If you lived in some of the more affluent areas, the least deprived as they call it, you'll live to 81. In the most deprived wards, if you're a female, you'll generally live to around 80 years of age. Or if you live in one of the more affluent areas, you'll live to 84. There's other statistics like suicide among the most deprived wards was 4 times more than the rate in the least deprived wards. drug-related deaths in the most deprived areas was more than 4 times the rate of the least deprived areas. And I can go on and on and on and tell you about these statistics. But statistics tell us a story, but it's us as politicians that need to come up with the answers. And there is answers out there. And so how we actually deal with it, we target objective need. We target the areas which need the support the most. So it doesn't matter, regardless of your colour, your class, your creed, your gender, your sexuality. If you are struggling and you are in these wards of multiple deprivation, government programs should kick in. We should be looking at intense support in these areas to lift those people out of poverty. And at the point, we're at a political crux because some of the political parties in this room don't believe in objective need. And that's probably one of the failures why there hasn't been an anti-poverty strategy. It's a reason why the executive was taken to court after a commitment in the St Andrews Agreement in 2007 for an anti-poverty strategy. And thankfully, hopefully the expert panel on the anti-poverty strategy is coming back. So yet again, how can we actually deal with this? So a resolute anti-poverty strategy, which thankfully the Communities Minister's expert panel has just reported, and we hope to have a draft anti-poverty strategy by the end of the year. But we also need to harness existing mechanisms that we have. Like government spends billions and billions and billions of pounds every year on contracts. So this is what's known as harnessing the power of social value procurement. So why doesn't government attach conditions to those contracts? So Paul was talking earlier about the low wage economy. So why don't we, and when government is putting out for these major £1 billion contracts, to say, well, if you want a government contract, we want to ensure that you pay your employees a real living wage, not the so-called minimum wage, a real living wage. You can't employ people on 0 hours contracts, and you can include a multitude of other factors. So we need to harness the power that we already have. And like I say,
you're well over 5.
Okay, sorry, Johnson. As I said, I could motor on, but thank you very much.
Well, there'll be plenty of opportunity, I'm sure, to come back and say all significant things as well. But thank you for that contribution and that input. We now move to Kate Nicholl, the Alliance Councillor for the Balmoral area. Kate, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here on behalf of the Alliance Party, and as a former Methody girl, always delighted to be in the company of Methodists, but mainly to speak on an issue that has become a policy focus of mine, and I'll explain to you why. Last year, I was sitting in my kitchen and I was feeding my 1-year-old his breakfast, and I always make too much of this. And he never finishes it. And on the radio, I heard Dr. Julianne Maney. I don't know if any of you heard this interview, but she was talking about the poverty that she's witnessed in hospitals. And she talked about a sick toddler saving toast in their nappy just so they would have something to eat later on. And small children devouring 3 bowls of cereal because they didn't know when they were going to get their next meal. And the fact that not every child in our city has the same start to life as my son is just so brutally unfair, so heartbreaking, but also completely avoidable. And I asked myself how we're allowing this to happen. And I reached out to people who are working on tackling poverty, from academics to charity organizations, really to better understand what as politicians more we should be doing. And just to say, I mean, this is a personal issue for me, and it's not just because I'm a mother or like all the elected representatives on this call. I work with people who are struggling to make ends meet every day, but because I have experienced the shame and the fear that comes with poverty. When I moved here from Zimbabwe when I was 13 with my mum, she had £50 to her name, you know. It was only because she got support from a fantastic charity, sadly not operating in Belfast anymore, Gingerbread, that we got the tailored support that we needed. And the more I speak to constituents who are living in poverty and the organizations who are supporting them, the more I realize that what people actually need is more money, more targeted support, and a long-term plan from government to tackle systemic injustice. not more food parcels. And I suppose I've been struck by the following key points, which some of the previous speakers have already raised. The first one is around stigma. Our welfare system is punitive and people are not getting enough. Those who need and are entitled to help are not claiming it because they're embarrassed to. People who are working but in poverty are struggling. Families now in poverty as a result of COVID-19 are struggling. For someone furlough, only getting 80% of your salary is completely fine, but for others, it's just simply not enough to live on. And we need to talk about the reality of poverty more, which is why this discussion is so welcome, but we urgently need a culture shift. I suppose the second point I really wanted to make is around the issue of access. And it's not just access to money and in a timely way, which is needed, but other things. For example, digital poverty has really come to the fore. We live in an online world more and more, as this event is testament to. And quite frankly, everyone should have access to the internet. Families don't need one device per household. They need devices for all their children. They need money for data. They need money for electricity. The access to support where community infrastructure doesn't exist is a massive issue. And I hope we can talk about this a bit more in the discussion, because there are a lot of issues in South Belfast where people are falling through the gaps. And then the third point I'd really like to make is that poverty is not just about access to food. Too often the political response is to give out food parcels. And I have such an issue with this, and I have such an issue with any politician who stands outside a food bank and takes a photograph of themselves with it, and such an issue with anyone who takes a selfie handing out a food parcel. It's not about food, it's about so much more. If your washing machine has broken and your kids can't go to school in clean clothes, a food parcel isn't going to help you. If you live in an unfurnished house and you need a bed, a food package isn't going to help you. If you need a meal, you most likely need it regularly. You don't need just a one-off. So I think it's really important that we think about what makes a tangible difference, and that's personalized support. The final point that I really want to make, and I think it's one of the most important ones, is on dignity. You know, people who give to charity are in a position of power over those who receive it. So if you go to a food bank, you're made to feel like you have to be thankful and grateful. There's no choice, there's no agency. People are being stripped of their dignity, and they shouldn't be grateful. They should have a government which is providing for them. And I think that's why the discussion around universal basic income is so important. We need to think big, we need to be brave, and I think we can rethink our systems, and I think we have to. Since I heard Dr. Maney's interview, I've been working on what we can do from a council and community planning perspective, looking at how we ensure funding is allocated on a thematic basis, not just along kind of perceived community divides, but also, as Ronan mentioned, you know, the anti-poverty strategy is so important, and the review of mitigations and the implementation of this has been painfully slow. So it's really important that we get a comprehensive and resourced anti-poverty strategy. And I understand that's going to be going out to consultation quite soon. So there's going to be an opportunity, you know, for all of us to play our part and to feed back into it. And, you know, yourselves as members of the congregation feeding into that, organizations, we all need to have our say. Poverty is entrenched and it's a complex issue. And while we do need to look at the impact, we also need to make sure that we're looking at the long term, because that's how we address the cause.
Kate, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm not sure if Paula has been able to join us as yet. Has Paula arrived? Or there was some talk about she might even participate from a car park by phone, but
sorry,
Eva,
I'm just off the phone to Paula there. Unfortunately, she's not going to be able to make it tonight.
Okay.
She's very disappointed. She was looking forward to it as chair of the Communities Committee, but I've been taking notes and I'm going to report back to her. So maybe she'll put something together even to circulate amongst yourselves after this.
Okay, so that's fine. Eva, thank you for that information. So we have heard from our representatives. We've heard from Paul also. We've had a number of important points, I think, that have been made that might lead into discussion. Robbie was talking about the need for people to participate in the design and change. Paul talked about the importance of data, why poverty is happening, changing policy, changing minds. Claire talked about changing systems and why systems lead into poverty. We need to look at systems, and that there is not an anti-poverty strategy in the Assembly. Ronan raised a point about poverty is a political choice. And again, he emphasized data, that stats and data tell a story. And Kate talked about people need to have a say. That's a similar point to what was made earlier, I think, as well. There were other points that each of you made, and it's now an opportunity for those of you who have been listening to come back with questions, maybe of clarification, with your own questions to probe a little further, and maybe observations or comments that you want to make in relation to what you've heard from our speakers. Our thanks again to Robbie, to Paul, to Claire, to Ronan and Kate. So over to the audience, and